Hello, and welcome to this edition of Outside In with today's special guest, Dr. Richard Haass, the author of the book, The World, A Brief Introduction. It's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion. My name is John Frank. I'm Vice President for United Nations Affairs at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft 26 years, about half that time outside the United States and Europe and half in Redmond. Today's discussion will focus around the world, and so we thought the UN Affairs team would be especially relevant. We've started a UN Affairs program. I think we're the first company to open a UN Affairs office. And it makes sense for Microsoft. For the past 20 years, we've been engaging with UN agencies on refugee issues, on human rights issues, as provider of technology. And so when we look at the big challenges we're facing today, the United Nations is a key forum for the issues, whether it's climate change or cybersecurity. We believe that companies should play a bigger role in addressing those challenges. Today's discussion will be about the world, a brief introduction. And Richard Haass is an esteemed diplomat and leader in the United States on foreign policy issues. He served in the White House with President George H.W. Bush, special advisor, and on the National Security Council. And he served as policy planning director at the State Department for Secretary of State Colin Powell. And for the past 20 years, he's been leading America's most prestigious foreign affairs institute, the Council on Foreign Relations. And so it's a pleasure to have you with us today, Richard. Richard, can you tell us, why did you write this book?
Well, thank you, John. It's good to be with you and your colleagues in Redmond and around the world. The reason I wrote this book is that simply too many citizens in the United States and other countries don't have a foundational or fundamental understanding of the world and how it affects their lives, why it matters. They don't necessarily have an appreciation of their country's foreign policy, how it influences the world, and again, in turn, how the world influences them. To switch very quickly to Thomas Jefferson, democracy requires informed citizens. It's the only way to have people hold their elected representatives to account. You can graduate from just about any 2 or 4 year college or university in the United States, from just about any high school, not have the basics of understanding of the world. The courses are often offered, they're just not required. If you watch the nightly news, I'm afraid you will not emerge wiser for it. If you go on the internet, there's a lot of tremendously good stuff. The problem is there's a lot of tremendously bad and accurate stuff, and there's nobody there holding little yellow stickums saying, read this, ignore that. So for all these reasons, I wrote what the British call a primer, Americans call a primer, and it was my effort to try to narrow the gap between what people understood about the world and what I thought they really did need to understand, again, to be informed citizens and to make informed choices.
And your book begins with a chapter on essential world history and beginning in 1736 to the present, and then goes and gives an analytic framework to think about the 6 regions of the world that you divide things into, and then talks about globalization issues or broader trends that we have today. On history, what lessons from world history do you view as being particularly relevant for today?
Well, to me, the lessons are that peace doesn't just happen. Order doesn't just happen. It's not the natural state of things. A lot of people watching this are scientists. Well, we learn in basic science that the power of entropy, the power of randomness, well, pretty much the same applies to international systems. My favorite book makes a distinction between the idea of a system and a society. And a society is something more. And the goal should be that the world operates a little bit as a society, with laws, with rules, with norms. And more often than not, history suggests it doesn't. Look at the 20th century. You had 2 world wars, stunningly destructive. And then the Cold War. What was so interesting about the 4 decades of Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is it stayed cold. It didn't spill over into conflict or much less nuclear war. And again, that wasn't preordained. There's almost nothing inevitable in history. Maybe that's the biggest lesson. People matter. Ideas matter. So now here we are. We're at a moment in history. We're at the beginning of the 3rd decade of this century. Well, we have a rising China, growing friction between the United States and China, the United States and Russia. So one set of questions is, what does history tell us about how do we manage the rise of great powers? How do we moderate or mute great power rivalries and frictions? That's one thing. a lot of experience with conflict. The one area where history doesn't have a lot to tell us, John, and it's too bad because in some ways it's the defining set of challenges of this era. Here we are at a moment of globalization. All sorts of things in great velocity and great volume are crossing borders. And one of the great challenges of this era, whether it's climate, whether it's health, whether it's the world you all work in cyberspace, is the gap between the challenges and the arrangements met to contend with them. So history doesn't offer us a lot of guidance. So one of the real issues for all of us is what do we do? How do we come together? A phrase you often hear is international community. Well, the short answer is there isn't one. How do we take an aspirational idea and make it an actual one? And how do we build arrangements, institutions, and so forth in the world to deal with a set of challenges for which history really doesn't have a lot to tell us about?
Well, we're all living through this common experience right now of COVID-19, and proof, and one of your phrases, what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. Well, what happened in Wuhan doesn't stay in Wuhan. Literally, it's become this global phenomenon. How do you, what are your thoughts on the global health system and how that's going to affect international cooperation?
Well, the first is anyone who has any questions about whether the world matters, it ought to have been settled. As you said, what began in Wuhan didn't stay there. It spread around the world. Just like on 9/11, what came out of Afghanistan with terrorists didn't stay there. Just like with climate change, what happens anywhere can have implications everywhere. Right now, for example, what happens in the Amazon rainforest doesn't stay in Brazil. We will all pay a price for what is going on there. So that to me is one lesson of the pandemic. The other is that even almost contradictorily, even though it is a global issue, national responses still matter. What's so interesting to me is if you look around the world, there's 190 odd countries. So there are successes and failures among democracies. There are successes and failures among authoritarian systems. So it's not the nature of the system that proves decisive. Turns out it's the nature of the leadership, what kind of steps they are prepared to take, what kind of messaging they carry out. It also, I think, shows the inadequacy, again, the point we were just discussing, in this case, the World Health Organization, clearly not up to the challenge. The problem is not just the people there, but these organizations like the World Health Organization in some ways are pretty much what the major powers want it to be. And countries push back and protect what they see as their sovereign rights. The problem is they then can't meet their obligations to their own people, much less to the citizens of other countries. And I think the challenge in the short run, say the next 6 months to a year, is going to be developing, producing, and disseminating a vaccine. Well, who's going to arrange for that? Who's going to be where in the queue? How are those who aren't in a position to produce it, how are they going to get what they need? Secondly, paying for it. Not just the vaccine, but for the relief and the recovery we're going to need around the world. And then I think there's a longer term question, which is how do we prepare for the next pandemic? Right now, we're struggling with COVID-19. Well, there's going to be COVID-22 or COVID-28. There may be bacteria that are immune to antibiotics that emerge. And what we've learned is the machinery, nationally and internationally, is inadequate. Okay, we've now had our warning. How do we address it? What can we do to make sure that if and when the next pandemic emerges, we're better positioned for it?
And of course, that's one of those, you make the compelling argument for cooperation, yet what we've seen is really a retreat to nationalism in so much of this. I mean, where do we find the political will to re-engage with the world to rebuild these institutions?
The risk of being self-centered, that's in part why I try to write the book, why I wrote the book, is I want people to understand that foreign policy isn't foreign and their own welfare is directly tied to the adequacy of international arrangements to deal with climate, to deal with health, to deal with terror, to deal with proliferation, to deal with cyberspace. So I want people, for example, this November when they vote, to have in their minds what are the positions of the various candidates, who is more likely to embrace policies that are not good for the world as an abstraction, as a form of philanthropy, but are good for the world in ways that are good for this country. Enlightened self-interest, if you will.
As a business, Microsoft pays close attention to trade policy. And there's a variety of aspects of trade policy, but we've seen less progress in the last several years on trade agreements and the rise more of imposing tariffs. Um, are tariffs a viable policy tool for the 21st century?
They're not viable if they're done unilaterally. Trade has been a great engine of development. I think it's an engine of a world order. It's an engine of economic growth. So I'm a big advocate of trade. I think there's no shock that in the 30s, when trade shrank because of protectionism, it was one of the forces that contributed to the dynamics that led to a Second World War. I think over the last 70 years, trade has grown tremendously. It's helped development. Literally billions of people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. There's much more democracy in the world than there was. Many standards of living have gone up tremendously. So I think trade has, on balance, been a great benefit. In specific cases, at times it is not. Certain jobs have been eliminated in part because of competition. More often than not, though, the reason for job elimination is not trade. As you know, it's productivity improvements, technology improvements, and there the challenge has got to be to reskill workers so they're prepared for the job to come and the job to come after that. I think we've probably reached a point where global trade agreements are almost impossible to negotiate. Very, very difficult. The Doha round, as you know, went nowhere. Instead, we've got more limited but still significant multilateral agreements, say things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the successor to that without the United States. Those are the kinds of agreements, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. I think the future of trade agreements is more different types of multilateralism, but I still think it's desirable to have global standards. I do think we need to think about a World Trade Organization that can adjudicate the inevitable differences. I would love to see the United States find a way into what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It would also be a good way to incentivize China to raise the level of its behavior. But I don't think there's a good future if we go down the path of unilateralism and unilateral sanctions and tariffs. I think that could be a real problem. I think there's one other issue, John, that doesn't get a lot of attention, but give me 30 seconds to mention it. One of the lessons of the pandemic is the danger of too much reliance on supply chains. And this time it was a pandemic. It could be a Fukushima. It could be a civil war. And I think there's going to be a movement towards a bit of supply chain resiliency, greater diversification, domestic production, domestic stockpiling. And one of the challenges for global trade is going to be, how can countries do this in a way that does not undermine global trade? If everybody basically says we're going to do this, this, and this at home, how do we coordinate that in a way that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater? And I think that's a real challenge for this government and other governments, is a coordinated approach. So if we do need greater self-sufficiency, I'm not saying we don't, but how do we do it in a way that's consistent with, rather than inconsistent with, the growth in trade we want to see?
One of the important aspects of trade policy and trade agreements today is increasingly focused on standards, environmental standards, safety standards,
Absolutely.
worker condition standards. And so actually the trade projects are meant to raise standards, which we as a company think are, that's really very beneficial for the world.
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons, again, I would love the United States to find a way into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, its successor agreement. If we did, that would then represent, 45% of global GDP. And we could do things about setting environmental standards, about labor standards. Indeed, just like I don't think there's going to be a new global trade agreement anytime soon, I don't think the future of dealing with climate change is going to be a top-down, everybody's in it agreement. I think, we're going to have to think about narrower forms of multilateralism, perhaps some ground-up agreements. So one possibility is that you marry climate to trade, and you basically say, if you want to trade and export to this block of countries that, say, represents half the world's GDP, here's the environmental standards you're going to have to meet. And if you're unable to meet them, here's the collective tariff we're going to apply to you. So if you're producing things, say, with coal or what have you. So I think that that's quite possible that designer trade agreements and designer climate agreements may come together in the future.
The countries that are most intensely involved in the trade disputes right now are the United States and China. And it's not just trade, it's a geopolitical set of issues. But if you were to sit down with the leaders of China and the US, what advice would you give on a path forward?
Well, first thing I'd say, it's important that we do sit down. There's not nearly enough sitting down. You'd think there'd be a lot. The lack of real strategic dialogue and conversation between the United States and China is stunning, and to me, inexcusable. So it's one thing we have to do. And I'd say before we did sit down with the Chinese, though, I would argue that Americans should also sit down with their allies. I think we'd be much more effective if we worked with the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Indians, the Vietnamese, and others, partners and allies, to come up with a common approach. But I think with the United States and China, I think we have to be realistic. We're very different systems. We have some real differences. In some areas, we're going to compete. And one of the things, again, we're going to want to do is be more competitive. And I think this affects immigration policy, education policy, infrastructure, and so forth here at home, levels of basic research. There's other areas we're going to have to negotiate with the Chinese, some rules of the road. And we're going to need, like we had during the Cold War, certain types of agreements, not to eliminate our differences, but to put a ceiling on them, to deal with the inevitable differences in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, over human rights. I think we have to agree that we're going to push back against China when necessary. We're going to criticize it when necessary, but it's an important but. We don't want to preclude still having areas of cooperation where it makes sense, whether it's on climate, whether it's dealing with North Korea or Afghanistan. So I think it's going to be an ambitious but feasible proposition where we have a competitive relationship. We try to make sure the areas of disagreement don't get out of hand, like we did with the Soviets during the Cold War. And we still try to maintain areas of limited cooperation, including trade. I don't think we ought to have an unfiltered trade relationship, but clearly we don't want to shut down this trade relationship. We don't want decoupling to get extreme. So this is all the stuff of negotiations.
Certainly in the technology sector, we see that decoupling very upfront and personal. So it is an area that we hope that the governments will focus on. But it's also, a lot of these issues, it's not just governments in today's world. It's going back to UN Secretary General Guterres talks about inclusive global governance. We sometimes refer to multi-stakeholder engagements. But we're looking at problems that can't just be solved by governments. And certainly in the private sector, we can contribute, but we can't solve these things ourselves. We believe there's an opportunity for broader engagements that include civil society, foundations, as well as companies on these issues. Which issues do you see a place where you think we could get to the table?
By the way, 100%. And I think the fact that you all in your company have a UN office is quite interesting. I think it's quite telling, good for you all. We'll take the area that you're involved in, the digital space. It seems to me it's inconceivable you would have a meeting, an international meeting that would try to set some of the ground rules for cyberspace. We have arms control regimes for dealing with certain types of arms, nuclear and otherwise. Well, our goal ought to be to regulate cyberspace, to prohibit certain things, encourage other things, regulate still a third area of things. Well, how could you do it without Microsoft and others at the table? You're an essential part of that conversation. So are perhaps the Facebooks or the Twitters, so are the Apples, what have you, but the Googles. I can't imagine having that conversation. Let me tell you a story in another area, which is global health. Probably about 10 years ago, the then Secretary General at the UN, Ban Ki-moon, called me up and basically said, I want to get the UN more involved in this. Can you help me? And he said, would you co-convene a meeting with us? And I said, sure, but it can't just be members of the Security Council or the General Assembly. I said, I'll do it, but I want to have the foundations there, say like the Gates Foundation and others. I want to have Big Pharma there, and so forth. Or after 9/11, I was the coordinator for the future of Afghanistan, and when I would have meetings about Afghanistan, I'd have my government meetings, but then I had a whole separate set of meetings where I brought in groups like Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières. I brought in the IRC and so forth, because you couldn't talk about what was going on the ground without the NGOs, because they had people and I think increasingly governance is going to be like that. It's going to include but not be limited to governments. And I think that's true domestically also, public-private partnerships, what have you, state, local, national. And I think internationally, look, the good news is you won't get a seat in the General Assembly. You won't have to sit through all those boring debates. but I do think you're going to be very much in the mix.
Well, we fully appreciate we're not a government, but there are some issues where we think we can contribute. And so one example is the Net Zero to Carbon Coalition. We as a company have very ambitious targets about being net zero by 2030, and then by 2050 for scope 1 and 2 emissions to have recaptured the full 75-year history of our emissions. And one of our goals, of course, is to learn from others and to share with others as we go. And so that kind of coalition is something we think can be really valuable, and the UN and other multilateral organizations can be a way to expand the reach and make progress.
100%. I think it's important that this has to be done multilaterally. One of the messages in my book and elsewhere is I'm not a big fan of unilateralism. I don't think there's anything we can do better as a country alone than we can do with others, but the others can't just be other countries. And you mentioned climate. Companies like yours, energy companies, and big consumers of energy and so forth, electricity, and so forth. I think they've all got to be part of the conversation. And it's more complex. I mean, to use an old cliched model, we now have lots of different kinds of pieces on the chessboard. It's not just the pieces that we grew up playing chess with. But I think that's just a reflection of reality, and that's also part of the potential answer.
Historically, that chessboard was largely military, and we've seen discussions about investment in military and defense. It's still a very big part of our economies. What are the trends that you see in the military space that citizens should be paying attention to?
Well, there's a couple of macro trends and a few others. The one macro trend that has been good, but I'm pessimistic about in the future, has been the trend in the decline of wars between countries. And you look at most of history and you look at the modern era, and it's become much more rare. We still see it. We saw Iraq invade Kuwait in 1990. We see what Russia's done in Europe more recently. But by and large, major wars between sovereign countries is relatively rare. I would say one of the principal aims of foreign policy has to see that it stays rare, whether it's US and Russia, US and China, China and India, China and Japan. I don't take it for granted. We've seen a real increase in wars within countries, and that's a worrisome development. Civil wars and again, not just wars fought between all sorts of entities. That worries me. The failed states and weak states in some ways. The Middle East in particular, you see elements of that. I think in terms of weaponry, we're seeing greater proliferation. Right now you have 9 countries with nuclear weapons. One of the goals has to be that there are not more, that you limit the arsenals of those 9. We obviously are not succeeding with North Korea. We don't want to see Iran getting there, because at some point, if North Korea passes a certain point, if Iran gets there, I think several of their neighbors are going to be tempted to follow suit. And that seems to me to be a recipe for real mayhem and real danger. We've seen the proliferation of small arms. I think the biggest question for the future might be new areas like space and new technologies like AI. And the question is, what differences are robotics, AI? Ultimately, a lot of these technologies will find their ways into the military. In some cases, they originated in that world. And it's going to have all sorts of consequences for efficiency, for casualties, for how wars are conducted. My hunch is in some ways the technologies are ahead of the thinking, and establishments are going to organizations are going to have to think about how to make use of them, how they need to change their organization, their doctrine. But the technology, again, is outpacing our ability to contend with it.
We have an international audience here today, but everybody pays attention to the U.S. presidential race. And this fall, we'll have 3 presidential debates, including one on foreign policy, international affairs. If you were the moderator, what questions would you be asking President Trump and Vice President Biden on that stage?
Just aside, it's possible this year you won't have a debate dedicated to that. It could be that you have 3 debates at the presidential, 1 at the vice presidential, and chunks of them could include foreign policy. 1 debate will mainly be questions from the public. The other 2 will probably foreign policy will be maybe a quarter, a third, I don't know, of the debates. Look, I would love to see a question about some questions about history. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to ask candidates or presidents about what they would do, because people always avoid hypotheticals. So it'd be very interesting to say, well, do you agree with what was done? Do you think the United States was right to have entered this war against Iraq, or did what we did in 1990, or did what we did in the Korean War, or so forth, used an atomic tool, the atomic weapons twice against Japan? There you can't say it's a hypothetical. So I think that could be really illuminating. So I would recommend that moderators ask people about that. This is an administration that has really been very critical of allies and alliances, very critical of multilateral institutions and treaties. So I would go there. I think also that's an area where there's real differences between the two candidates, between President Trump and Vice President Biden. And I would try to illuminate those differences. Why is he so critical of alliances? Why has he withdrawn from a dozen international institutions and treaties? And get Vice President Biden to say why he disagrees. Why does he think alliances are arrangements where the benefits far outweigh the costs? Why does he think that it's better for the United States to be in the World Health Organization than outside it? Perhaps in the Iran nuclear agreement than outside it, in the Paris Agreement than outside it. I would really focus on that rather than asking them, again, the future. I would focus on what we know about their differences. And again, I would push them, and I'd be fascinated to know what their take is on historical events, what lessons they've derived. I actually think we could learn something.
Certainly, at this point, Vice President Biden has deep expertise and experience in foreign affairs, and President Trump's had 4 years as president of the United States dealing with these issues. And so I think learning about their future based upon their views on the past is really an interesting approach. You're one of the world's leading experts. You get to live and breathe international affairs and foreign policy 26 hours a day. Now, our audience, we're trying to, begin with a brief introduction. What would you advise ordinary citizens, besides reading your book is a good start? Where do they go from there?
Well, one is to accept the importance of it, that it really does matter, that the world will affect their lives, and we're seeing it in spades right now with the pandemic. I would say, there's just half dozen real quality newspapers: New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Washington Post, what have you. The Economist is obviously still a good read. Every now and then, The Atlantic or The New Yorker has something valuable. I think the magazine we publish is the single best magazine in the world about foreign policy and international relations, called Foreign Affairs. It really is by far the leading magazine journal in the world, and you've got daily articles coming out on its website. There's quality things like National Public Radio, certain things of public television. But by and large, again, the internet is wildly, wildly uneven, so it can be a dangerous place to go. There's no authentication, there's no real editing. The nightly news is really empty. Now the morning shows, the 7 o'clock network shows are pretty empty of the world. So I think you've got to seek it out. One thing I'd like to do, and again, it's a reason I wrote the book, is I would like to make it required that before you did graduate from a Stanford or a Harvard or anywhere, any college, before you graduated from high school, I would love to see some type of civics education. And to me, there's two sides to the civics coin. One is domestic. I would like more people, say in this country, to understand the nature of their own democracy and political system, be exposed to the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, de Tocqueville and others, understand some of the basics. And I'd like to see people exposed to the equivalent of international civics. You're at the UN. What about balance of power? What about sanctions or tariffs? What about trade? What about war? What about proliferation or terrorism or climate change or global health or the digital space? So I would like to see people get a grounding. So again, they would be they don't have to do this for a career. I don't expect people, to all become diplomats or what have you. But again, I want them to be informed citizens. Or if they're working at a company and someone says, what about a sanction or a tariff? I would like them to be in a position to judge whether that is in their interest. Someone says, well, we want to have a war here or there. Well, is that a good or bad thing? So I would like, again, people to be much more informed. And I think the ways, there are ways to get it. But I would love to see parents and others begin to insist that this becomes part of a curriculum.
One of the great things about being part of the Microsoft community is we are a global organization, and we literally have people on the ground in most countries of the world, and we have customers literally in every country where it's permitted by law. But we have experience of working with business and partners and customers, but that's not the same framework for understanding. The experience that we live is, we are very connected in a sense, but we don't necessarily have the framework that your book provides in terms of some of the more diplomatic history and the political developments that help frame the business environment. And so I just want to second the importance of taking time to read your book. We're providing downloads for employees that'll be part of this webcast, and really encouraging people to take the time to use it and use it as a reference book as well, because I found that it's thought-provoking, but it just fills in a lot of gaps. People may know a topic, but knowing in a structured primer is incredibly valuable.
Well, thank you for saying that. If it makes you feel better, I learned a lot by writing it. You have to be somewhat immodest to set out to write a book like this. As you know, when you write something and you try to teach it, you very quickly exhaust what it is you know, and you've got to drill down, and to explain something, you've really, really, really got to know it, and you've got to understand it and own it. I learned as much or more than any reader is going to learn in writing this book. So for me, it was also, it forced me to really get comfortable and understand stuff I'd been working with on one or another level for decades. There's nothing about trying to explain something, as we all know from our personal lives, it forces you to really to get to the bottom of, to get its essence.
Well, and I wanted to come back to, you sort of stole my thunder a little bit.
Apologies.
At the beginning with the quote. I mean, towards the end of the book, it's this really, I think, important quote. The history also teaches that order is not the natural state of international affairs and does not just emerge or continue automatically. So to the contrary, it requires commitment and concerted effort by governments and others who are willing and able to put aside their differences in an effort to sustain it. And so I think that is really, for me, one of the core messages that I would like our listeners to take away, which is we need to be engaged in the world. We all have a stake in ensuring a prosperous and peaceful world. And I think that it sure is helpful to learn a bit as we go.
Yeah, I agree. And another way to say it is the last 70, 75 years have been quite remarkable. And with the end of World War II, if you look at the sweep of history from roughly 45 through now, I defy anyone to come up with a more remarkable era where there's been less war between countries, more economic improvement. The average lifespan in this country has gone up over a decade. In other parts of the world, it's gone up over 2 decades. More people are living with a degree of freedom than ever before in human history. It's quite remarkable. And one of the messages I wanted to transmit is don't take this for granted. Our goal should be to make the last 75 years, if you will, the new normal. The last thing we want the last 75 years to be is an aberration. And then we return, if you will, to history. That to me would be tragic. One of the things, again, there's nothing inevitable about the future. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I don't assume it's automatically going to play out well, that the good times, relative good times of the last 75 years are somehow going to automatically continue. So if people read this and understand as citizens or through Microsoft, however, in their lives, they get more involved, fantastic. Because again, good things just don't happen because they ought to happen.
As a global company, we've greatly benefited from the globalization process, the open markets, and then just the opportunity for us to really build a global business and engage, an employee network around the world. But the challenges of globalization are non-trivial. For us, finding ways to contribute to addressing those challenges will be the opportunity that we look forward to.
Yeah, well, you began by asking me about the lessons of history and where they can be applied, and that's where we really need the input from people at Microsoft and from Microsoft collectively, because as I said, that's where history has less to give us. This is really this is what makes this era different. The degree of globalization, this new set of issues and challenges that's come along. So this will be a time not just for technological innovation, but intellectual innovation. And then we can then hopefully build political and economic arrangements to lock in some of the upsides of those innovations. So this is a challenging time. Hopefully people will rise to it.
Well, Richard, thanks very much for being with us today. Encouraging our employees to not just get a copy of your book, but to use your book. And we hope to continue this dialogue. And thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, John. And thank you also for being part of the Council on Foreign Relations family. Great to have Microsoft.